The heavy rain drummed against the towering windows of Raven's Hollow Palace as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her headlamp for the third time that evening. The beam of light cut through the darkness of the grand ballroom, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny ghosts in the stagnant air. She had been working as a historical preservation specialist for over 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the mystery that would unfold in this abandoned English manor. Sarah's partner, Marcus Rodriguez, emerged from behind a massive marble column, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The former detective-turned-private investigator had reluctantly agreed to accompany her on this midnight expedition, though he still questioned the wisdom of exploring a centuries-old palace at such an ungodly hour. "The building inspector said we'd have better access without the daytime construction crew," Sarah explained, as if reading his thoughts. "Besides, some of these old places reveal their secrets better in darkness." The palace had been abandoned for nearly 40 years after the last heir of the Blackwood family disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Now, a wealthy tech entrepreneur had purchased the property with plans to convert it into a luxury hotel, but city regulations required a thorough historical survey before any renovation could begin. Sarah's task was straightforward: document any artifacts, architectural features, or historical elements that needed preservation. What she hadn't expected was to stumble upon evidence of a decades-old mystery that had baffled investigators and historians alike. The Blackwood family had owned Raven's Hollow Palace for over 3 centuries. Built in 1687 by Sir Edmund Blackwood, the estate had been home to generations of aristocrats, politicians, and eccentric collectors. The family's wealth had come from various sources over the years: shipping, textiles, and eventually investments in early industrial ventures. Lady Victoria Blackwood, the last known resident, had vanished on a stormy night much like this one in 1984. She was just 28 years old, newly married to a French diplomat named Philippe Dubois. The couple had been living in the palace for only 6 months when Philippe reported her missing after she failed to return from what she claimed was a late evening walk through the estate grounds. The investigation that followed was exhaustive but fruitless. Scotland Yard found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, and no indication that Lady Victoria had planned to disappear. Her personal belongings, including valuable jewelry and family heirlooms, remained untouched in her bedroom. Her car was still in the garage, and her bank accounts showed no unusual activity in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Philippe had cooperated fully with the investigation, even submitting to multiple polygraph tests. Friends and family described their marriage as happy, though some noted that Victoria had seemed increasingly interested in researching her family's history in the months before she vanished. She had been spending long hours in the palace's extensive library, poring over old documents, letters, and genealogical records. After 2 years of investigation with no new leads, the case was classified as a missing person with suspected voluntary disappearance. Philippe eventually returned to France, and the palace was sealed pending resolution of the complex inheritance issues that arose from Victoria's presumed death. Sarah had read the case files as part of her research into the property's history. The mystery of Lady Victoria's disappearance had always intrigued her, but she was here as a historian, not a detective. Her job was to catalog the palace's architectural and historical significance, nothing more. As she and Marcus made their way through the grand foyer, Sarah couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship of the marble staircase that curved elegantly toward the upper floors. The wrought iron railings were works of art in themselves, featuring intricate designs of ravens and holly leaves, a play on the family name and the estate's moniker. "This place gives me the creeps," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Despite his years of experience dealing with crime scenes and dangerous situations, there was something about the oppressive atmosphere of the abandoned palace that unsettled him. Sarah smiled in the darkness. "It's just history, Marcus. These walls have seen centuries of human drama. Births, deaths, celebrations, sorrows. You're probably just picking up on the accumulated emotional residue." They climbed the staircase slowly, Sarah's camera flash periodically illuminating portraits of long-dead Blackwood ancestors. The paintings were in remarkably good condition despite decades of neglect, protected by the palace's solid construction and the dry climate of the interior. The second floor contained the family's private living quarters. Sarah and Marcus explored bedroom after bedroom, each one frozen in time like a museum exhibit. In what appeared to be the master bedroom, Sarah found evidence of the hasty departure that had followed Victoria's disappearance. Clothes still hung in the massive wardrobe, and personal items remained scattered across the dresser. Marcus picked up a silver-framed photograph from the nightstand. Even in the dim light of his flashlight, he could make out the image of a beautiful young woman with dark hair and striking eyes. She was standing next to a tall, handsome man with distinctly European features, presumably Lady Victoria and Philippe on their wedding day. "She was lovely," Marcus observed, setting the photograph back in its place. Hard to believe someone would just vanish without a trace. Sarah was examining the books on the bedside table when something caught her attention. Unlike the other volumes, which were covered in a thick layer of dust, one leather-bound journal appeared to have been moved recently. She carefully lifted it and opened to the first page, where she found Victoria's name written in elegant script. The journal entries began shortly after Victoria's marriage and detailed her growing fascination with her family's history. She wrote about discovering inconsistencies in the official family records and her suspicion that previous generations had hidden secrets about the source of their wealth. One entry dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance was particularly intriguing. "I found references to something called the Raven's Secret in great-grandfather's correspondence. Edmund's letters mention a treasured burden that each generation must guard. Philippe thinks I'm becoming obsessed, but I know there's something important hidden in this house, something that explains why our family never spoke openly about certain periods of our history." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she read the entries aloud to Marcus. Here was evidence that Lady Victoria had been actively searching for something in the palace before her disappearance. But what was this Raven's Secret, and why had she been so determined to find it? As they continued exploring the second floor, Sarah documented everything she found while Marcus took note of potential security issues and structural concerns. The palace was in better condition than either of them had expected, despite its long abandonment. The Blackwood family had clearly spared no expense in its construction and maintenance. In what appeared to be a study or library, Sarah discovered an extensive collection of books, documents, and artifacts related to the family's history. The room was a historian's dream. Original letters, business records, and personal correspondence dating back to the palace's construction. But as she began to examine the materials more closely, she noticed something odd. Many of the documents from the late 18th and early 19th centuries were missing. The filing system suggested there should have been extensive records from this period, but entire drawers were empty or contained only fragments of what had once been complete collections. "Someone's been through here," Marcus observed, noting the obvious signs that the room had been systematically searched. "And recently, too. Look at these dust patterns." Sarah nodded, her historian's instincts telling her that someone had deliberately removed specific documents. But who and why? The palace had been sealed since Philippe's departure in 1986. The only people with access should have been the estate lawyers and the occasional building inspector. As they prepared to move to the third floor, Sarah's flashlight beam swept across an ornate mirror hanging on the library wall. For a moment, she thought she saw something reflected in the glass that shouldn't have been there. A flicker of movement in the darkness behind them. She spun around quickly but found nothing except Marcus examining a bookshelf. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "See what?" Marcus replied, looking up from a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's plays. "I thought I saw—" "Never mind. It was probably just shadows." But as they climbed toward the third floor, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone in the palace. Every creak of the old floorboards, every whisper of wind through the ancient windows seemed to suggest hidden watchers in the darkness. The third floor had once housed the servants' quarters and storage rooms. Most of the rooms were small and simply furnished, a stark contrast to the opulence of the floors below. But as Sarah and Marcus worked their way down the narrow hallway, they discovered something unexpected. One room at the end of the corridor was different from the others. Instead of simple servants' furnishings, it contained what appeared to be a workshop or study. Tables lined the walls, covered with magnifying glasses, small tools, and what looked like partially completed jewelry pieces. "What do you think this was used for?" Marcus asked. examining a delicate gold chain that lay unfinished on one of the work tables. Sarah studied the setup carefully. It looks like a jewelry workshop. Maybe Lady Victoria was learning to make her own pieces? Or perhaps she was having family jewelry repaired or modified? As she examined the tools more closely, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Several of the magnifying glasses and small instruments were typically used for examining precious stones and metals, the kind of equipment a professional appraiser would use. On a shelf above one of the work tables, she found a collection of reference books about gems, precious metals, and jewelry authentication. The books were well used, with numerous pages marked and annotated in what appeared to be Victoria's handwriting. But it was the discovery of a hidden drawer in one of the work tables that truly caught their attention. Marcus had been examining the table's construction when he noticed that one side seemed thicker than it should be. A careful search revealed a small spring-loaded mechanism that, when pressed, revealed a narrow drawer concealed within the table's frame. Inside the drawer, they found a collection of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be detailed drawings of various pieces of jewelry. The photographs showed rings, necklaces, bracelets, and other ornate pieces, each one carefully catalogued with notes about materials, estimated age, and provenance. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she examined the documents. They appeared to be research notes about specific pieces of jewelry, including detailed historical backgrounds and, in some cases, information about previous owners. One file was particularly thick, containing dozens of photographs and pages of handwritten notes about a single item, a ring. The photographs showed an extraordinary piece of jewelry. A large ring featuring what appeared to be a dark, unusually cut stone, surrounded by smaller gems in an intricate setting. The craftsmanship was clearly exceptional, and even in the photographs, Sarah could see that this was no ordinary piece of jewelry. Victoria's notes about the ring were extensive and detailed. She had traced its history through multiple generations of the Blackwood family, noting that it had been mentioned in family correspondence as early as the 1780s. But what was most interesting was her theory about the ring's significance. According to her research, the ring was not simply a piece of family jewelry, but rather the key to understanding the Raven's secret she had written about in her journal. She believed that the ring contained clues about hidden aspects of the family's wealth and history, secrets that previous generations had gone to great lengths to conceal. Her final notes about the ring were dated just 3 days before her disappearance. In them, she expressed excitement about a breakthrough in her research. She had apparently discovered the ring's current location within the palace and was planning to retrieve it for detailed examination. "I'm convinced that the ring holds the answer to everything," she had written. The symbols in the stone setting matched descriptions in great-grandfather's coded letters. "Tomorrow night, when Philippe is away at the embassy reception, I'll finally be able to examine it properly. If I'm right about what I'll find, it will change everything we thought we knew about our family's history." Sarah felt her heart racing as she read the final entry. Here was evidence that Lady Victoria had found something significant just before her disappearance, something important enough to risk exploring the palace alone at night. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think Lady Victoria found something that last night, something that might explain what happened to her." Marcus examined the photographs and notes with the experienced eye of a former detective. "These are professional quality research notes," he observed. "She wasn't just playing around with family history. This was a serious investigation." As they carefully repacked the documents and photographs, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the ring itself. Victoria's notes indicated that she had discovered its location within the palace, but there was no indication of where that might be. The discovery of the hidden workshop raised new questions about Lady Victoria's disappearance. Had she found the ring she was searching for? If so, where was it now? And what secrets might it have revealed about her family's history? As the clock struck 2 in the morning, Sarah and Marcus decided to call it a night. They had already discovered more than they had expected, and both were beginning to feel the effects of several hours exploring the vast palace. But as they made their way back toward the main staircase, Sarah's flashlight beam caught something that made her stop in her tracks. There, on the dusty floor of the hallway, were footprints. Recent footprints that definitely had not been there when they arrived. The prints were small and delicate, clearly made by a woman's shoe. They led from the servants' stairway at the back of the building toward the room where they had just discovered Victoria's hidden workshop. Marcus knelt down to examine the prints more closely. His detective training told him that these footprints had been made within the last few hours, possibly while they had been exploring other parts of the palace. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we need to leave now." But even as they hurried toward the main staircase, both of them knew that their midnight exploration of Raven's Hollow Palace had uncovered something far more significant than historical artifacts. They had stumbled upon evidence of a mystery that was still very much alive, and someone else was searching for the same secrets that had led to Lady Victoria's disappearance all those years ago. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sarah's small apartment as she spread Victoria's research materials across her dining room table. Despite getting only a few hours of sleep after their midnight adventure at Raven's Hollow Palace, she found herself unable to rest until she had examined every photograph and document they had discovered. Marcus arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying coffee and pastries from the local bakery. His years as a detective had taught him the value of maintaining energy during intensive investigations, and he sensed that what they had uncovered was just the beginning of something much larger. "I've been thinking about those footprints all night," he said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. "Someone else is looking for whatever Victoria was searching for. The question is whether they found it first." Sarah nodded, her attention focused on a particularly intriguing photograph of the mysterious ring. In daylight, she could see details that had been obscured by their flashlights the previous evening. The ring's central stone was unlike anything she had encountered in her years of studying historical jewelry. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the stone's unusual surface. Victoria's notes describe it as having an almost mirror-like quality, but with strange markings that only become visible under certain lighting conditions. She believed these markings were actually a form of code. Marcus leaned over to examine the photograph more closely. Even in the image, he could see that the stone's surface seemed to shimmer with an inner depth that suggested hidden complexities. Around the central stone, smaller gems were arranged in a pattern that appeared decorative but might have held symbolic significance. Sarah had spent the early morning hours researching similar rings in her professional databases. While she found examples of elaborate family signet rings and ceremonial jewelry from the same period, nothing matched the unique characteristics of the Blackwood ring. "I think we need to go back to the palace," she announced, looking up from her laptop. Victoria's notes suggest that she had figured out exactly where the ring was hidden. If we can follow her research, we might be able to find it ourselves. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And if whoever made those footprints is still there, then we'll deal with that when it happens." "But Marcus, this could be one of the most significant historical discoveries I've ever been involved with. I can't just walk away from it now." The truth was, Sarah felt a personal connection to Lady Victoria's quest that went beyond professional interest. Like Victoria, she had always been drawn to historical mysteries and the secrets that lay hidden in old documents and forgotten artifacts. The idea that someone had vanished while pursuing the same kind of research that had defined her own career was both thrilling and sobering. After spending several more hours studying Victoria's materials, Sarah began to piece together the logic behind her search. The ring was apparently connected to a period in the Blackwood family history that had been deliberately obscured from official records. Victoria had found references to it in private correspondence between family members, but always in coded language that suggested secrecy and caution. The most revealing document was a letter dated 1789, written by Sir Edmund Blackwood III to his son Charles. In it, he referred to the burden our family has carried since the time of troubles, and insisted that the Raven's treasure must never be spoken of openly, lest it bring destruction upon our house. Victoria had interpreted this and similar references to mean that the Blackwood family had come into possession of something valuable and possibly controversial during the late 18th century. Her theory was that the ring served as both a symbol of this secret and a literal key to accessing whatever it was they were hiding. She was convinced that the ring would lead to physical evidence. Sarah explained to Marcus as they prepared to return to the palace. Probably documents or artifacts that the family had hidden somewhere in the building. Something significant enough that they were still protecting the secret nearly 200 years later. Marcus packed his equipment bag with additional lighting and some basic security tools. His instincts told him that they would not be alone at the palace, and he wanted to be prepared for any situation they might encounter. What if Victoria actually found what she was looking for? He asked as they drove through the countryside toward Raven's Hollow. What if that's why she disappeared? It was a question that had been nagging at Sarah as well. If Victoria had successfully located the ring and uncovered the family's secret, why had she vanished? Had she discovered something so dangerous that she felt compelled to disappear? Or had someone else been threatened by her discoveries? The palace looked different in daylight, though no less imposing. The Gothic architecture that had seemed mysterious and romantic in the darkness now appeared stern and forbidding under the gray English sky. Sarah could see why the building had remained empty for so long. There was something about its presence that suggested it was guarding secrets. They entered through the same side door they had used the previous night, but this time, Sarah led the way directly to Victoria's hidden workshop on the third floor. She wanted to examine the documents they had found more carefully and look for any clues they might have missed. As they climbed the servant stairs, Marcus noted that the mysterious footprints from the night before were no longer visible. Either their owner had returned and covered their tracks, or the building's cleaning crew had been more thorough than expected. In the workshop, Sarah spread out Victoria's research materials on the largest table and began to study them systematically. She was looking for any indication of where Victoria might have believed the ring was hidden. The notes contained numerous references to specific locations within the palace, but most were written in abbreviations or codes that were difficult to decipher. One recurring notation caught her attention. E.S. Third Raven from the East. Victoria had written this phrase in several different documents, sometimes with additional notes like below the watchers and where the light fails. I think this is a location code, Sarah told Marcus. Victoria was being deliberately cryptic, probably because she was concerned about someone else reading her notes. Marcus was examining the workshop's construction when he made an interesting discovery. Behind one of the work tables, partially concealed by shadow, was a small opening that led to what appeared to be a hidden passage. The opening was just large enough for a person to crawl through, and it extended into the darkness beyond the room's walls. "Sarah, you need to see this," he called softly. The passage was clearly original to the building's construction, not a later addition. It was lined with the same stone that formed the palace's walls, and it appeared to follow the building's structure toward other parts of the third floor. Servant passages, Sarah realized. Many houses of this period had hidden passages that allowed servants to move through the building without being seen by the family or guests. Victoria might have discovered this and used it in her search. They decided to explore the passage, though both were acutely aware that they were venturing into unknown territory. Marcus led the way, his flashlight beam revealing a narrow corridor that extended for several yards before branching in multiple directions. The passages were more extensive than either of them had anticipated. They formed a network that connected different parts of the third floor and also provided access to the floors below. As they explored, Sarah began to understand how someone could move through the palace undetected, and how Victoria might have conducted her secret searches without Philippe's knowledge. At one intersection of the passages, they discovered evidence that someone had been using them recently. Fresh scratches on the stone walls suggested that someone had been moving through the corridors with equipment or supplies. More disturbing were the clear signs that someone had been observing the palace's main rooms through hidden viewing ports built into the walls. "Whoever made those footprints last night has been watching this place for a while," Marcus observed. "They know about these passages, and they've been using them to monitor anyone who enters the building." The realization that they were likely being watched sent a chill through both of them. But Sarah's determination to solve the mystery of Victoria's disappearance outweighed her concern for their safety. She was convinced that they were close to a breakthrough in understanding what had happened that night in 1984. Following Victoria's coded notations, they made their way through the passages toward what Sarah believed was the location referenced as E.S. Third Raven from the East. Her interpretation was that this referred to the East Study on the second floor, specifically to something associated with the third Raven in a series. When they emerged from the passages into the East Study, Sarah immediately understood what Victoria had meant. The room's elaborate ceiling featured a series of carved ravens, each one positioned to appear as if it were watching over the room below. The third raven from the eastern wall was directly above an ornate bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes. "Below the watchers," Sarah murmured, recalling another of Victoria's notations. She began examining the bookshelf carefully, looking for any sign of a hidden compartment or secret mechanism. Marcus stood guard at the room's entrance while Sarah worked. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he had was telling him that they were in danger. The palace felt different than it had the night before, as if something had changed in the hours since their departure. Sarah's careful examination of the bookshelf revealed what she was looking for. Behind a row of books about European history, she found a small lever, disguised as part of the shelf's decorative woodwork. When she pressed it, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment, wrapped in oiled silk, was a small wooden box. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted it out and set it on the study's desk. The box was clearly old, its wood darkened with age, and it was secured with an intricate brass lock that appeared to be original to the piece. "This is it," she whispered to Marcus. "This has to be where Victoria found the ring." But when Sarah carefully opened the box, her heart sank. The interior was lined with faded velvet, and there was clearly a space designed to hold a ring, but the box was empty. Whatever Victoria had found there was gone. However, the box was not entirely empty. At the bottom, beneath the velvet lining, Sarah discovered a folded piece of paper. The paper was yellowed with age and appeared to be much older than Victoria's research materials. Unfolding the paper carefully, Sarah found herself looking at what appeared to be a map or diagram of the palace. But this was unlike any architectural drawing she had ever seen. Instead of showing rooms and corridors, it depicted a complex series of symbols and notations that seemed to correspond to specific locations within the building. At the center of the diagram was a detailed drawing of the ring they had seen in Victoria's photographs. Around it, connected by intricate lines and symbols, were representations of other locations within the palace. It was as if someone had created a treasure map, with the ring serving as the central key to understanding the entire system. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed, studying the diagram. "It's like a code that uses the palace itself as the cipher. Victoria must have found this with the ring and used it to locate whatever the family was hiding." Marcus examined the diagram over Sarah's shoulder. His detective training helped him recognize patterns and connections that might not be obvious to others. What he saw concerned him. "Sarah, look at these dates in the corner. This diagram wasn't created by the original Blackwood family. Someone made this much more recently, within the last 50 years, I'd guess." Sarah looked where Marcus was pointing and felt her blood run cold. He was right. The paper might be old, but the ink used for several of the notations was clearly modern. Someone had been updating and modifying the original diagram, adding new information and corrections. "Someone else has been searching for the same thing Victoria was looking for," she realized, "and they've been at it for decades." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the study. The steps were deliberate and unhurried, suggesting someone who was familiar with the palace and unafraid of discovery. Marcus quickly moved to the window, while Sarah hastily refolded the diagram and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Through the glass, he could see a black sedan parked near the palace's main entrance, a car that definitely had not been there when they arrived. "We need to leave," he whispered urgently. "Now." But before they could move toward the hidden passage, a woman's voice called out from the doorway. "Dr. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, there's no need to run. I've been waiting for you to return." They turned to see an elegant woman in her 60s standing in the study's entrance. She was impeccably dressed despite the early hour, and her bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority and control. But it was her eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They held the same intelligent intensity she had seen in the photographs of Lady Victoria. "My name is Margaret Sinclair," the woman continued, stepping into the room. "I believe you've found something that belongs to me, something that my sister Victoria discovered shortly before her disappearance." Sarah felt her world shift as the implications of the woman's words sank in. Lady Victoria had a sister who had been searching for the same secrets and who apparently knew exactly what they had found. "Victoria didn't disappear," Margaret continued, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and determination. "She was murdered, and I've spent the last 40 years trying to prove it. The wine cellar beneath Raven's Hollow Palace was a maze of stone archways and ancient storage chambers that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Sarah led the way with her high-powered flashlight, following Victoria's diagram toward what appeared to be a specific location, marked with an intricate symbol that resembled a crowned fleur-de-lis. Marcus brought up the rear, his senses heightened after discovering that their conversation in the East study had likely been monitored. The small electronic listening device he had found behind the books confirmed his suspicions that they were not alone in their investigation of the palace's secrets. Margaret moved between them with surprising agility for a woman in her 60s, her familiarity with the palace layout evident in the confident way she navigated the narrow passages. She had clearly spent considerable time exploring the building during her decades-long investigation into Victoria's disappearance. Victoria chose this location carefully, Margaret explained as they approached the area indicated on the diagram. The wine cellar was one of the few parts of the palace that Philippe rarely visited. He preferred modern vintages and had little interest in the estate's historical collections. The symbol on the diagram led them to a section of the cellar that appeared to be older than the rest. The stonework was rougher, suggesting that this area dated to the palace's original construction in the 17th century. Unlike the more recent storage chambers, this section felt almost primitive, with low arched ceilings and walls that wept moisture despite the building's generally dry condition. Sarah consulted the diagram again, trying to match the symbols with physical features of the space. According to this, we're looking for something associated with the third pillar where angels fear to tread. The cryptic notation made sense when they located a series of stone pillars that supported the cellar's vaulted ceiling. The third pillar from the entrance was decorated with carved figures that appeared to be angels, though their faces had been worn smooth by centuries of moisture and age. Marcus examined the pillar carefully, running his hands over the carved stone surface. His exploration revealed something unexpected. One section of the carving was slightly loose, as if it had been designed to move. "Here," he called quietly to the others, "this section isn't solid." Working together, they managed to slide the carved stone panel to one side, revealing a hidden compartment within the pillar itself. The space was small but carefully constructed, lined with lead to protect its contents from moisture and decay. Inside the compartment, wrapped in oiled leather, was a wooden box similar to the one they had found in the East study. This box, however, was not empty. When Sarah carefully opened it, she gasped at what she saw inside. The box contained a collection of jewelry that was clearly from a different era than anything the Blackwood family would have owned. The pieces were unmistakably French in style, featuring the elaborate craftsmanship and precious stones favored by the aristocracy of the late 18th century. "These are some of the items from Victoria's inventory," Margaret said, her voice filled with emotion. "After all these years, we've finally found proof of what she discovered." Sarah carefully lifted a necklace from the box, examining it with her trained eye. The piece was extraordinary, a collar of diamonds and sapphires set in gold, with craftsmanship that spoke of royal commissions and unlimited budgets. Even in the dim light of the cellar, the gems sparkled with an inner fire that suggested their exceptional quality. "This isn't just valuable," she told the others. "This is historically significant. Jewelry like this was often commissioned for specific occasions or to mark important family events. If we can trace its provenance, it might tell us exactly which French family owned it." Marcus was more interested in the implications of their discovery. If Victoria found this and other similar caches throughout the palace, she would have had physical proof of the Blackwood family's secret. No wonder someone wanted to stop her from exposing the truth. As they carefully documented their find, taking photographs and detailed notes, Margaret shared more of what she knew about Victoria's final weeks. Victoria had become increasingly concerned about Philippe's behavior in the months before her disappearance, Margaret revealed. She began to suspect that he knew more about the family's secrets than he had initially let on. She carefully lifted a ring from the collection, holding it up to the light. Victoria discovered that Philippe had been asking detailed questions about the palace's history and the location of family valuables. She initially thought he was just being a devoted husband, interested in his wife's research. But then she found evidence that he had been meeting secretly with someone else. Sarah looked up from photographing the jewelry. "What kind of evidence?" Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, phone records, all indicating regular meetings with someone in London. But Philippe had told Victoria he was attending embassy functions during those times. Margaret's expression was grim. Victoria hired a private investigator to follow him. Marcus felt his detective instincts sharpening. What did the investigator find? Philippe was meeting with an art dealer who specialized in what he called discreet acquisitions. Essentially, he was a fence for stolen art and antiquities. The investigator managed to photograph several of their meetings and even recorded one conversation. Margaret reached into her jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, one that had clearly been upgraded multiple times over the years to preserve its contents. This is a copy of that recording. Victoria made it just days before she disappeared. She pressed play, and they heard a conversation between two men speaking in heavily accented English. One voice was clearly Philippe's, while the other belonged to someone older with a distinctly upper-class British accent. "The inventory is more complete than we anticipated," Philippe's voice said through the small speaker. "She's found references to at least 30 major pieces, including several that we thought had been sold decades ago." "That's impossible," the other voice replied. "My family has been careful to dispose of the most valuable items gradually. Nothing should remain in the palace." "You underestimate your cousin's thoroughness," Philippe responded. "Victoria has traced items that your family apparently forgot about or assumed were lost. She's found hiding places that haven't been disturbed since the original concealment." Sarah felt a chill as the implications of the conversation became clear. The second voice belonged to someone from the Blackwood family, someone who had been systematically selling the French artifacts over the years. "Which family member was this?" Marcus asked Margaret. "We never identified him definitively, but Victoria suspected it was her cousin Gerald Blackwood. He was the only family member who had both the knowledge and opportunity to access the hidden collections over such a long period." The recording continued, revealing more details about the ongoing criminal enterprise that had been operating within the Blackwood family for decades. "The problem is that she's planning to go public with her discoveries," Philippe's voice continued. "She's already contacted the French Cultural Ministry about returning the items to their rightful owners. That cannot be allowed to happen," the other voice said coldly. "Too much is at stake. Too many people would be implicated. What do you suggest?" "Victoria must be stopped, permanently if necessary." The recording ended, leaving the three of them in stunned silence. They had just heard what appeared to be a conversation planning Victoria's murder, recorded just days before her disappearance. "This is evidence of premeditated murder," Marcus said grimly. "Combined with the artifacts we're finding, this could be enough to reopen the case." But even as he spoke, they became aware of sounds elsewhere in the cellar. Footsteps and voices that suggested they were no longer alone in the palace's underground chambers. Margaret quickly turned off the recorder and began repacking the jewelry they had found. "We need to leave." Now, Sarah was reluctant to abandon their search when they were so close to uncovering the full truth, but we've barely started looking for the other locations on Victoria's diagram. If we're captured or killed, none of this evidence will ever see the light of day. Margaret replied practically, "We need to get what we've found to safety and plan our next move more carefully." Marcus was already moving toward the cellar's exit, his experience telling him that the sounds they were hearing suggested multiple individuals moving through the palace with purpose and coordination. These were not casual intruders or curious explorers. They were people who knew the building well and were conducting a systematic search. As they made their way through the cellar's winding passages, Sarah couldn't help but think about Victoria's last days. The young woman had uncovered evidence of decades of criminal activity, only to be silenced before she could expose the truth. Now, 40 years later, the same people who had killed her were prepared to kill again to protect their secrets. They reached the cellar stairs just as they heard voices coming from the direction of the wine storage area they had just left. Someone had discovered their presence and was following their trail through the underground chambers. "This way," Margaret whispered, leading them toward a different staircase that emerged in the palace's kitchen area rather than the main house. "There's a service entrance that leads directly to the grounds." As they climbed the narrow stairs, Sarah clutched the photographs and documentation they had gathered. Even if they didn't find all of Victoria's hidden caches, What they had discovered was enough to prove that the young woman had been murdered to cover up a massive art theft conspiracy. They emerged into the palace's old kitchen to find the room flooded with moonlight streaming through tall windows. The space felt different from the rest of the palace, more utilitarian, less oppressive. It was here that generations of servants had prepared meals for the Blackwood family, unaware of the dark secrets their employers were protecting. Marcus checked the service entrance and found it unlocked, though he suspected this was not an oversight. Someone wanted them to use this exit, possibly to drive them into a trap, waiting outside. "We need to assume that all the obvious exits are being watched," he told the others. "Is there another way out of the building?" Margaret nodded toward a door at the far end of the kitchen. "The old root cellar connects to a tunnel that leads to the estate's original ice house. From there, we can reach the woods without being seen from the main house." As they prepared to make their escape, Sarah took one last look around the kitchen. In the moonlight, she could see evidence of the palace's long abandonment: dust covers over furniture, cobwebs in the corners, the accumulated debris of 40 years of neglect. But she also noticed something that made her pause. On the kitchen's main preparation table, barely visible in the dim light, was a thin layer of dust that showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Someone had been using this room, and recently. "Margaret," she whispered, "how often have you been in the palace over the years?" "Not often. A few times when I could manage it without being detected." "Why?" Sarah pointed to the disturbed dust on the table. "Someone's been using this kitchen regularly. Look at the patterns. This isn't from a single visit or even occasional use. Someone's been working here." Marcus examined the evidence with his trained eye and came to the same conclusion. Sarah's right. Someone's been treating this place like a regular workspace. The implications were disturbing. If someone had been using the abandoned palace regularly, it meant they had easy access to the building and were comfortable moving through it undetected. It also suggested that their current situation might be even more dangerous than they had realized. "We need to go," Margaret urged, her voice betraying anxiety. "If someone's been using the palace as a base of operations, they know it better than we do. Our advantage is mobility, not local knowledge." As they moved toward the root cellar entrance, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a situation that had been planned long before they arrived at the palace. The electronic surveillance device, the regular use of the kitchen, the systematic nature of their pursuit, all of it suggested an organization with resources and experience. Victoria's murder had not been a crime of passion or a single act of desperation. It had been part of a larger criminal enterprise that had been operating for decades, and that enterprise was still active. The root cellar was even more primitive than the wine storage areas, consisting of rough stone chambers carved directly into the hillside beneath the palace. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and their flashlight beams revealed walls lined with empty wooden shelving that had once held the estate's food supplies. Margaret led them through the cellar's maze-like layout with the confidence of someone who had explored these spaces before. She had clearly spent considerable time learning the palace's hidden passages and secret routes during her years of investigation. The tunnel to the ice house was narrow and low, requiring them to move in single file with their heads bent. Sarah found herself thinking about Victoria making this same journey on her final night, perhaps carrying evidence she hoped to hide before confronting those who were threatening her. When they emerged into the ice house, they found themselves in a circular stone building that had been designed to store ice cut from the estate's ponds during winter months. The structure was partially underground, with thick walls that had kept it cool even during the warmest summer months. More importantly, the ice house had multiple exits, including one that led directly into the woods surrounding the estate. From there, they could reach Margaret's car without being observed from the palace. As they prepared to leave the ice house, Marcus held up a hand for silence. Through the thick walls, they could hear the sound of vehicles approaching the palace, multiple vehicles moving at high speed. "They're bringing reinforcements," he observed grimly. "Whatever we've stumbled into, it's big enough to justify significant resources." Sarah clutched the jewelry box they had recovered from the cellar, understanding that it represented more than just evidence of a decades-old crime. It was proof of an ongoing criminal conspiracy that someone was prepared to kill to protect. "Where do we go from here?" she asked Margaret. The older woman's expression was determined despite the danger they faced. We take this evidence to someone who can't be bought or intimidated, someone with the authority and resources to properly investigate what we found. As they slipped out of the ice house into the darkness of the estate's woods, none of them noticed the figure watching from the palace's third-floor window. The observer lowered a pair of night vision binoculars and reached for a radio. "They're heading for the woods," the voice reported. "They have some kind of container with them, probably evidence from the cellar. We know who they are now, and we know what they've found. There are other ways to handle this situation." The figure at the window smiled grimly. After 40 years of successfully concealing Victoria's murder, they were not about to let 3 amateur investigators destroy everything they had built. 3 days after their escape from Raven's Hollow Palace, Sarah stood in the sterile conference room of Scotland Yard's headquarters, watching as Detective Inspector James Crawford examined the French jewelry they had recovered from Victoria's hiding place. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed harsh after the mysterious shadows of the palace, but it also felt safer, more rational. Margaret sat beside her, having finally found law enforcement officials willing to listen to her decades of research. The presence of physical evidence combined with the recorded conversation between Philippe and his accomplice had transformed her from an obsessed amateur investigator into a credible witness in a murder case. Marcus paced by the window, his detective instincts still on high alert, despite their apparent safety. The past 3 days had been tense, filled with careful planning and secure communications, as they worked to present their evidence to the proper authorities without alerting those who had killed Victoria. "These pieces are extraordinary," Detective Inspector Crawford said, setting down his magnifying glass. "The craftsmanship is consistent with late 18th century French court jewelry. If your theory is correct, some of these items could be worth millions of pounds individually." Sarah had spent the previous day working with experts from the British Museum to authenticate and evaluate their findings. The preliminary assessment confirmed what Victoria had discovered decades earlier. The jewelry was not only genuine but represented some of the finest examples of pre-revolutionary French goldsmithing. "The provenance research will take time," Crawford continued. "But we've already found historical records that match several of these pieces to specific French aristocratic families. The documentation your sister compiled is remarkably thorough, Ms. Sinclair." Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the formal acknowledgement of Victoria's work. For 40 years, she had fought to have her sister's discoveries taken seriously. Now, finally, Victoria's research was being recognized by professionals who understood its significance. "What about Philippe Dubois?" Marcus asked. "Have you been able to locate him?" Crawford's expression darkened. "That's where things get complicated. The man who married Lady Victoria under the name Philippe Dubois doesn't appear to have existed before 1983. We found no birth records, no educational history, no employment history prior to his appearance at the French embassy." Sarah felt a chill at this revelation. So he was using a false identity from the beginning? "It appears so. We're working with French authorities to determine his real identity, but it's likely he was a professional criminal who specifically targeted Lady Victoria as part of a larger scheme. The implications were staggering. Victoria's marriage had been based on a lie from the very beginning, designed to give the criminal organization access to the Blackwood family secrets. She had been manipulated and ultimately murdered by someone who had never loved her at all. "We've also made progress in identifying the second voice on the recording," Crawford continued. "Voice analysis suggests it belongs to Gerald Blackwood, Lady Victoria's cousin, as Ms. Sinclair suspected. We've issued a warrant for his arrest, but he appears to have left the country shortly after your visit to the palace." Margaret leaned forward in her chair. "What about the electronic surveillance device you found? Can that be traced?" "Professional-grade equipment, probably military or intelligence service origin. Whoever has been monitoring the palace has significant resources and technical expertise. This isn't a simple art theft ring. It's a sophisticated criminal organization with international connections." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer as more evidence was analyzed. What had begun as a family secret about hidden French treasure had evolved into a multi-generational criminal enterprise involving art theft, murder, and international fraud. Crawford opened a thick file folder and spread several photographs across the conference table. Based on the diagram you found and additional research into the Blackwood family's financial records, we estimate that dozens of valuable artifacts were stolen from French refugees and gradually sold over the past 2 centuries. The photographs showed artwork, jewelry, and documents that had appeared in auction houses and private sales over the decades. Each item could be traced back to the original French collection that Sir Edmund Blackwood III had agreed to protect. The total value of stolen property could exceed £50 million, Crawford continued. But the cultural significance is even greater. Some of these items are unique historical artifacts that belonged to families wiped out during the French Revolution. They represent irreplaceable pieces of French cultural heritage. Sarah studied the photographs, recognizing several pieces from Victoria's research materials. The young woman had not only uncovered evidence of her family's crimes, but had also identified specific items that could be recovered and returned to their proper owners. Lady Victoria's plan to expose the truth and return the stolen property would have destroyed not just her cousin's criminal enterprise, but potentially implicated dozens of collectors, dealers, and auction houses who had unknowingly or knowingly handled stolen goods. That's a lot of people with strong motives to keep the secret buried. Which brings us to our current problem, Crawford said, his expression serious. The people who killed Lady Victoria are still active, and they know that you've discovered evidence that could destroy them. We have reason to believe that attempts may be made to silence all 3 of you. The reality of their situation hit Sarah with full force. By uncovering Victoria's evidence, they had made themselves targets of the same criminal organization that had murdered the young woman 40 years earlier. What kind of protection can you offer? Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't optimistic about the answer. Limited. Unfortunately, we're dealing with people who have significant resources and international connections. They've successfully covered up a murder for 4 decades and operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise without detection. They're not going to be deterred by standard police protection measures. Crawford stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the London streets below. However, we do have some advantages. The evidence you've uncovered gives us legal grounds to freeze assets, obtain international warrants, and coordinate with law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. We can make it very expensive and difficult for them to operate. Sarah understood the subtext of what Crawford was saying. They were dealing with criminals who were powerful enough to threaten witnesses and sophisticated enough to evade conventional law enforcement, but the evidence they had found was strong enough to eventually bring them to justice. There's something else, Crawford said, returning to the table. We've been monitoring communications intercepts since your visit to the palace. It appears that the organization is planning something significant, possibly an attempt to recover or destroy any remaining evidence at Ravenshollow. They're going back to the palace? Our intelligence suggests a major operation within the next few days. Multiple individuals, sophisticated equipment, possibly even explosives, to destroy parts of the building that might contain additional hidden caches. Sarah felt a surge of urgency. Victoria's diagram showed dozens of hiding places throughout the palace. If they destroy the building, all of that evidence will be lost forever, which is why we need your help, Crawford said, looking directly at each of them. We're planning a coordinated operation to secure the palace and recover any remaining evidence before they can destroy it. But we need people who understand Victoria's research and can interpret her hiding places. Margaret stood up immediately. Of course I'll help. Victoria died trying to expose the truth. I won't let her killers destroy the evidence she died to protect. Sarah felt torn between her desire to see justice done and her concern for their safety. What kind of operation are you planning? A joint effort with multiple law enforcement agencies. We'll have the palace surrounded and secured before attempting to recover the remaining artifacts. You would be working with professional archaeologists and evidence technicians with full security protection. Marcus was already thinking through the tactical implications. When do you need an answer? Tonight. Intelligence suggests their operation is planned for tomorrow evening. If we're going to beat them to the remaining evidence, we need to move immediately. As they left Scotland Yard that afternoon, Sarah found herself thinking about Lady Victoria's final night at the palace. The young woman had discovered evidence of centuries of crime and cover-up, only to be murdered by those who profited from maintaining the secret. Now, 4 decades later, Victoria's hidden evidence was about to expose the truth she had died trying to reveal. But the same criminal organization that had killed her was prepared to destroy everything rather than face justice. That evening, as they prepared for their return to Raven's Hollow Palace, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was cultured, elderly, and unmistakably threatening. "Dr. Chen, I believe you have something that belongs to my family. Something that Lady Victoria stole before her unfortunate accident." Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice from Margaret's recording, the same upper-class British accent that had discussed Victoria's murder with Philippe decades earlier. Who is this? Someone who has spent considerable effort protecting family interests for many years. Someone who would prefer to resolve this situation quietly and without further unpleasantness. "You mean the way you resolved things with Victoria?" The voice chuckled coldly. Lady Victoria was an idealistic young woman who didn't understand the complexities of family responsibility. She wanted to destroy centuries of careful stewardship to satisfy her naive notions of justice. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. "Stewardship? You mean theft and murder." "I mean protecting cultural treasures from the chaos of revolution and war, ensuring they survived when their original owners could not. The Blackwood family has been faithful guardians of these artifacts for over 2 centuries. By selling them for profit, by ensuring they remained in private collections where they were cherished and preserved, rather than being destroyed by mobs or lost in government bureaucracies." The voice took on a more threatening tone. "But this conversation is academic, Dr. Chen. What matters now is that you return what you've taken and cease your interference in family matters. Do this, and you and your associates will be allowed to resume your normal lives. And if we refuse, then you will share Lady Victoria's fate. The choice is yours, but I won't offer it again." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in the sudden silence of her apartment. The criminal organization wasn't content to destroy evidence. They were prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened their secret, just as they had eliminated Victoria. She immediately called Marcus and Margaret to inform them of the threat. Within an hour, they were all under police protection, preparing for what might be their final opportunity to expose the truth about Victoria's murder and recover the evidence she had died trying to protect. As they reviewed their plans for the next day's operation at Raven's Hollow Palace, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria's ghost was somehow guiding their efforts. The young woman's research had been meticulous, her hiding places cleverly chosen, and her documentation thorough enough to survive 40 years of concealment. Tomorrow, they would return to the palace where it all began, hoping to find the final pieces of evidence needed to bring Victoria's killers to justice. But they would be racing against time and facing adversaries who had proven willing to kill to protect their secrets. The midnight search, that had begun with historical curiosity, was about to culminate in a confrontation that would either expose a centuries-old criminal conspiracy or claim 3 more victims in its cover-up. As Sarah tried to sleep that night, her dreams were filled with images of Lady Victoria walking through the dark corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace, searching for truth in the shadows while her killers closed in around her. In the morning, they would follow in Victoria's footsteps, hoping to complete the work she had died trying to finish. The ring that had started it all, the mysterious piece of jewelry containing the French refugees' inventory, remained missing, possibly destroyed by those who had murdered Victoria. But the evidence she had hidden throughout the palace might still be waiting to tell its story, if they could find it before her killers destroyed it forever. The final chapter of Lady Victoria's quest for truth was about to be written, and Sarah, Marcus, and Margaret were determined that this time justice would not be denied.